Hi folks, this is Jonathan Quantford here speaking to you from Jar Jawarang country in Bendigo. A little while ago, Susie Castle asked if I would come and contribute to your series on stewardship. So I run a Christian ministry called Manna Gum, which is essentially, we call it a ministry in good news economics. And the core purposes of Manna Gum is to help Christians reclaim an understanding of what the Bible has to say about economic life, about how we use money and stuff, how we get money, what we do with our money and stuff in the world, and what the Bible has to say about that, and how we apply that to the complex global economy of the 21st century. So thinking about our use of resources, both individually, but also as communities of faith, is core to what I do. It's a shame I'm not able to be there in person to talk with you. It's always better that way, but such is the times that we live in. So to keep things a bit more interesting for you, I'm going to use some slides so you've got something else to look at rather than just my ugly mug. I'm just going to share my screen now. So bear with me for a moment. No. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So although your faith community has been thinking about stewardship, I'm not going to talk so much about stewardship as such, but really I want to take a step or two back and to situate how we think about our use of money and stuff within the idea of the church more fundamentally. And basically the core idea I want to put to you, an idea that's really we've lost sight of really in modern times, is that the core idea of what the church is and called to be is it's called to be an economic community. Just while I'm on this slide, I'll note that if you want to find out more about Manna Gum and what it does, and a number of things I mentioned today, I've written about at much greater length than I'll get to speak about today. You can find all of that stuff on our website, and the site is there. So I want to begin right back, really, before we think about money and stuff, is to begin at least briefly to ask what is the church, which is obviously a huge question and quite a deep question. But I just want to say some basic things about it. At its most essential level, the church is simply a gathering, and our word church, or ecclesia in the Greek, simply means gathering. It's a gathering of those who confess Jesus as Lord. That is, it's a gathering of people who come together to worship the God who is revealed in Jesus, and to witness to the God who is revealed in Jesus. That's what the church is, a gathering of people for the purpose of worship and witness. But it's not just a gathering of individuals who do this. It's quite clear in the New Testament. The New Testament is very strong on this, that this is a community, and it is a strong form of community. So the terms that the used in the New Testament to describe this community are terms such as a body, a living thing, a household, and a family. Now, these are all terms that describe a very strong forms of connection. And it's quite clear from the New Testament and from the life of the early church, really, that this was to be a new type of community, a community that was called to be quite different from the communities that it found in the world of the Roman Empire around it. Another thing that's clear in the New Testament, both in the Gospels as Jesus gathers together the 12 disciples, but also in the writings of Paul in the New Testament, is that this new community that's called the church has a very strong link to the community that was called together in the Old Testament, Israel. And essentially, we can say that the calling, the vocation that is given this new community is the same as that was given to Israel. In fact, we can say that this new community is called to fulfill the vocation that was given to Israel. And we could talk about that in lots of different ways, but one of the simplest ways is the way we find in the book of Isaiah, for example, where Israel is described and called to be a light to the nations, a community that witnesses to the world about the character of God through the character of its own life. One of the things that's not, I think, adequately appreciated about the vision of Israel in the Old Testament, particularly the vision of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, what we call the Torah, is that it had as a central part of the calling and the vision of what Israel was to be, an economic vision. It's very clear that Israel is called to be a particular type of economic community. And I do a whole series of talks on this subject. So obviously I'm just going to skim the surface and very briefly summarize the core components of what that economic vision for Israel was. And that was simply to say that it was called to be a community of justice, where there was equality, a strong sense of neighborliness, where there was care for the earth, and that's a surprisingly strong part of the commandments of Torah, actually. And we could sum it all up, the economic life the picture of economic life that's being painted in the Torah as an economic life of living within limits, that is, observing limits for the care of the community as a whole, the care of self and care of the earth. And within the bigger economic picture of the Torah, one component of that is the sharing of abundance, which is often what we get to when we think about stewardship, the questions of tithes and offerings. It's important, I think, to situate what the teachings of tithes on tithing and offerings in the Old Testament within its broader economic vision, though. It's a sharing of abundance that has a deep, broad, and rich economic vision behind it. So if we're going to think about what sort of economic community is being talked about in the New Testament, we cannot bypass Jesus's teachings on money, which unfortunately so often is done in today's churches. So the Gospels, particularly the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record Jesus as having a lot to say about money. In fact, Jesus speaks about money and wealth and possessions more than any other subject other than the kingdom of God. And virtually everything Jesus has to say around money and wealth and possessions in the Gospels are hard things. We find them very difficult, which is, I guess, one reason why they're so often avoided within our churches. But if we're to take Jesus seriously and the emphasis that he puts on this realm of life, then we need to grapple with them in some way. Now, I don't have time to really unpack Jesus' teachings on money, and if you're interested, you can find a whole series on Jesus' teachings on money on the Manna Gum website of a series of articles. Let me just try and very briefly summarize what I think Jesus is getting at and having such difficult things to say. And when I'm talking about his hard sayings, I'm thinking of things where Jesus says that no one can be my disciple unless they give away all their possessions, or how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God, or blessed are the poor, woe to the rich. And perhaps most strikingly, no one can serve both God and mammon, or God and wealth. What is Jesus getting at? My view is that right at the heart of these teachings on money and wealth and possessions is not Jesus trying to make things difficult for us as his followers, or not trying to make ethical heroes out of us, but actually Jesus is addressing wanting us to take care for one of the most powerful destructive forces in the human world, and that's the power of mammon, or money. And the picture I've put with this slide is an artist's rendition of mammon as an idol, a false god that humanity often falls to worship. And if you only have to really take a brief look at the world around you, whether it's your local community or turn on the news and think about what's happening in the world, to see what a profoundly destructive force money can be in human affairs. So my view is that Jesus' teachings on money have as their concern a form of breaking the power of money over us, its spiritual power, if you like, and releasing it to be a force that can be used for good in the hands of the people of God. So there's three sorts of things Jesus is calling for in his teachings in money. The first is practices of renunciation. That's saying no. And that's what Jesus is getting at when he's asking people to give their money away. It's a way of breaking the power of money's hold on us by actually giving it away. The second thing he's calling us to is not just breaking money's power over us, but it's a movement towards the other. It's the movement of generosity, of showing care for a broader community with our money. And finally, at the heart of all the economic teachings of the Bible, actually, not just the New Testament, or not just in Jesus, is this idea of a profound gratitude for the goods of creation, actually, being thankful for what we have, and this idea that we can be content with a little and therefore feel free to give generously of what we have. So these are the teachings that shaped the New Testament and the early church's understanding of its own economic life. So right from the beginning of the church, after the ascension of Jesus, we see the church being described in the New Testament as an economic community. So the story that narrates the birth of the church, which you all know in the story of Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit comes to the followers of Jesus in Jerusalem, is a story of the birth of an economic community. So if you remember Acts chapter 2, it begins with tongues of fire, and in the Greek, the proper way of translating the word, the tongues of fire being distributed amongst those who are gathered there. And at the end of the chapter, we see those same believers distributing, same word, their material goods one amongst another, such that there was no poor among them. And we see in Acts chapter 2 actually the fulfillment of the calling of Israel in Deuteronomy, where Israel is called to be a community where there is no poor among you. So the story that narrates the birth of the church begins with a distribution of spirit and ends with a distribution of material goods. And that's a good way of summarizing, if you like, actually the whole Bible's view on economic and material life, which is that spiritual life should always influence material life, should always flow into and has a necessary link to our living out of material life. Now, that is actually stated again and again throughout the New Testament in different ways. I've just put one example there in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, where Paul has an extended teaching about the sharing of abundance within the church. And significantly, Paul draws on the story of the manna in the wilderness in the Old Testament, which is, if you like, the foundational economic story of Israel, a story in which none shall have too little and none shall have too much. And that's Paul's understanding of what should be the character of the church. And he sees that as happening through the free-flowing sharing of abundance within this community. So Generally, what that comes down to for many churches today is to think about the practices of tithing or giving or offering, or whatever language you use. It's important to note that actually we have lost sight of the much stronger and thicker forms of economic community that existed, the very strong forms of material sharing of goods and food, and money that we see in the New Testament, and actually not just the New Testament, but we find in the documents of the early church for pretty much the first 300 years of the church's life. That's not our experience of church, and the core way in which we can and still do think or might think about our churches is as economic communities is through the practices of tithing and giving. So let me just say something briefly about that. Firstly, obviously, when we use the language of tithing or offering, we're reframing Old Testament practices where tithes and offerings were a part of Israel's economic life, something that a structured part of its economic vision of a community of neighborliness and care. And the way it's described in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, for example, as the purpose of the tithe is for the care of the widow, the orphan, the alien, and the Levite. Or to summarize that, it's really the purpose of the care is to for the functions of service, making sure that service happens in the community and the worshipping life of the community is maintained. That's one way of summarizing that. So we think about tithing in quite a different context, but I think the idea of the tithe is still quite helpful to us. So actually, Jesus, when he speaks about tithing at all, he affirms it as a practice. We should note, though, that Jesus actually is calling his followers to something much more than tithing plus. But seeing as we've really lost a lot of the depth and sense of what Jesus has to say about economic life, I think tithing is not a bad place to start. The idea of giving 1/10 of your income, which these days used to be quite a standard practice, I think is increasingly a challenging idea for many people. I think it's a good place to start. It would be the wrong place to end thinking about how we think about economic community as a church, as churches. And we generally have often lost sense of the sort of radical meaning of tithing too. We often think of it, because I think what we've fallen into habits of thinking about the church as this abstract institution that's out there and is asking for us, like a charity, asking for us to give our money to it. We've lost sight of it as a form of coming together ourselves, of pooling our income as groups of people, as cooperatives of people who are coming together to see God's work done in our communities. And I think that's the right way to think about tithing, as income pooling or as a cooperative effort to see God's work done. That's the work of service and mission and worship happening in local communities. And actually, within the alternative economy and new economy movements that we see happening today, which don't have much to do with Christianity often, we're actually seeing a recovery of these sorts of ideas of people pooling together their income to fund good work in their communities. And they're actually recovering the old idea, the ancient idea of tithing. If only we knew what a radical practice that we have at the heart of being church. So I've talked for long enough now. It's really just, I have to say, the tip of the iceberg in thinking through these subjects. I hope I've given you something worthwhile to think about. But let me finish by stressing that what I've said about church's economic community is really just the beginning of how we think about this subject. And there's so much more to be opened up. I hope that you feel interested or inspired to begin having a look at opening that subject up yourself in your own faith journey. So thank you for your attention, and I'll say goodbye.